So what I'll try and do is focus on training aspects before, and as we move on from training aspects, maybe to a little bit beyond the basics. So I checked up the intercollegiate surgical curriculum program as Shamit asked me to, and I find that this is listed not under pediatric, but maybe under rhinology as a neoplasm. And I looked up as to what you must know, which was about patterns of spread, histological types, multidisciplinary approach to the management of skull-based issues. And I'll take you through a bit of that. And then we'll go through a little bit more about how we do these operations. And I find that this is not something which is a must-know thing, which is natural, same for our trainees. But nevertheless, I'll take you through a couple of operations and try and demonstrate the principles that we list out as to how we apply them to patients and to surgery. So I'll do this in 3 bits. We will review the must-know bits and the good-to-know bits, which is the point number 1, clinical presentation diagnostic features. I suspect much of this would be there for lots of you already. We'll go a little bit beyond the basics, and then we'll see how we apply this to surgery. And I'm sure there'll be time. We'll then take you through the principles and demonstrate to you. So we can break twice in between and take questions as things go on. So bit 1, the basics. So we know this. It's something which is exclusive to adolescent boys. I say near exclusive. I haven't ever seen a lady with this. They say that if you do see a lady, then you should be doing chromosomal analysis to actually check on it. But I haven't never seen a lady. But I have seen this illness in patients who are older, 40s, 50s, and even one case beyond. But unusual. I mean, I would say 99 out of 100 times. So I only remember a couple of patients which have been beyond the age of 25. So near exclusive to adolescent boys, and it is believed that it regresses with adulthood. Very unusual, but there are reports. And we do know that this is a sex hormone dependent tumor. And if you look at these slides and you do immunohistochemistry, then you can out there see that the stromal cells and the vascular cells, both aspects of the tumor, have androgen receptors and also estrogen, progesterone, everything there really. So there's a lot about prevalence, incidence, and this is the most reliable estimate I've ever found. This again comes from Denmark, where all such reliable estimates come from, which tell you it's 3.7 per million males per year. So if I look at my population of this city, which is 20 million, I know it's beyond the imagination of many, but 20 million, 10 million males, you would generally expect 37 patients a year. But of course, we drain, we are a tertiary quaternary referral hospital, which drains an area much, much, much larger than Delhi. And we tend to do about 30, 25 to 30 cases a year, which is, of course, enough. So how does it present? It presents with nasal obstruction and epistaxis. We know that most tumors present with nasal obstruction and epistaxis. And when I was training, if you had a 12-year-old with these or an 8-year-old with these, then of course the DD varied between adenoids and antroconal polyp and an angiofibroma, with angiofibroma being far rarer than the other possibilities. In those days, we didn't quite have CTs and endoscopes, and all that stayed with us. And this is why it's important: is to do a lateral neck X-ray if you were confronted with such a situation. And what the lateral neck X-ray would show you would be a mass in the nasopharynx, which was adherent to the roof, which is very much like an adenoid, and expansion of the pterygomaxillary fissure. So what you see out there is the posterior wall of the maxilla pushed forward, and the anterior wall of the pterygoid base pushed backward. So that is the expanded pterygomaxillary fissure. There's another example of the same. Sadly, I'm embarrassed to say these are not my slides. I used to have a huge collection, but when I went back to them, I find they've all been lost to the pre-digital era. The digital era, I don't quite have one of my own. So these are from the net. And this is what we call the Hallman-Miller sign. And certainly in my time, you couldn't get through an exam if you did not know this. So to put in perspective, this is a normal X-ray, and what you see in the X-ray is the posterior wall of the maxilla and the anterior wall of the pterygoid, and you see that V, which is the pterygomaxillary fissure, which was something which was quite well known to my generation, and it has of course been lost in the fullness of time. So if you looked at this, and if you still do an X-ray for someone who's an adenoid, who presents with adenoids, and you don't quite have anything else, this is what you need to look at, the pterygomaxillary fissure. And if it's normal or expanded. If it's expanded, then you know that this is a tumor in the pterygomaxillary fissure which is collapsing in. Of course, nobody does this now. As I said, I myself didn't have one of these. So nowadays, if you have such a patient, you would either do a CT scan or you do an endoscopy. And what you would find on the endoscopy is a mass which is usually submucosal, because you must remember this is a mass which takes origin in the pterygomaxillary fissure and pushes through into the nose. So it will come from the posterior end of the middle turbinate from the sphenopalatine area, and it will be in the posterior middle meatus, and it will be under the mucosa, and you will see these dilated vessels on it. It will be pinkish, and it's near diagnostic really if you are looking at a male in the right age. But yes, the other DDs would include the odd tumor like a hemangioperistoma. So today we tend to make the diagnosis more by radiology. So if you get a CT, you will again see the Holman-Miller sign, which you see out there. The pterygoid base pushed backward and the posterior wall of maxilla pushed forward. You see the normal pterygomaxillary fissure there, the lateral pterygoid plate, the medial pterygoid plate, and of course the maxillary sinus. You can see it's enhancing. If you do a coronal view, you could often see that as this tumor comes from the pterygomaxillary fissure into the nose, it would often erode the floor of the sphenoid sinus. It's a fairly characteristic sign. If it's intracranial, almost, I would say 9 out of 10 times, it would be involving the superior orbital fissure. So you would see it here. And if you do an MR, you would see the salt and pepper appearance in the typical location. So again, pterygomaxillary fissure, posterior nose, nasopharynx, dumbbelling into the posterior, into the pterygomaxillary fissure, and then expanding again in the infratemporal fossa with the salt and pepper appearance, where the pepper, of course, is the high flow voids of the vascular elements of the tumor, and the salt is the white fibrous elements of the tumor. And if you look at your coronal scan more carefully, then you can see the Vidian canal. So you can see the Vidian canal on the left is there. And you can see that it's not quite seen so well on the side of the tumor, which is again a very typical feature. So diagnosis is by radiology, and if you have all these features, intensely enhancing, expansile but not erosive, so you know what it means. It pushes the sphenoid septum to the other side, it pushes the septum to the other side, it expands the superior orbital fissure, but doesn't quite erode through that bone. You don't quite see a lot of moth-eaten appearance. So an expansile mass indicating a benign mass, which is very vascular, which is salt and pepper on MR, which is in the typical location in the pterygomaxillary fissure, expanding laterally into the infratemporal fossa, medially into the nose and the nasopharynx, and superiorly into the orbit, and then on into the intracranial site. Then you know what you are dealing with. Of course, there's still the Holman-Miller sign, which is what you see here. Pterygoid base erosion, Vidian canal erosion, which we talked about. You see the Vidian canal eroded on this side, and the sphenoid floor erosion, which you see. So you put this all together and you have your diagnosis, and certainly it's not on to a biopsy. I think everybody knows that. The diagnosis is by CT or MR, and of course, preferably a CCT. So that was basics. That was, of course, must know quite a few things. Now we've gone a little bit beyond the basics. So what lists here is again just the basics: intensely vascular, histologically benign tumor in the pterygomaxillary fissure, pterygopalatine fossa, and intense vascular leads to life-threatening epistaxis, and diagnosis by radiology, no biopsy. So what else? If you look at it histology, then it has fibrous and vascular components, but what you really need to look at is that the vascular components, and that's are very sinusoidal. These vessels are large, but they are like capillaries. So you don't quite have the muscle or the elastic fibers around these vessels, which is why when you get a breach of the tumor, then you don't quite find the tumor, the bleeding remitting. The bleeding tends to continue because the vessels can't quite contract. They don't have the means to contract. The other aspect, which if you look at on histology, is this doesn't have a capsule. I know grossly it seems very well encapsulated, but it's much like a parotid pleomorphic adenoma. It has a pseudocapsule, but not quite a capsule. And this has implications with regard to residual disease and recurrent disease. This is a tumor which can involve the marrow and the cancellous bone, and it's difficult to detect. So it has no capsule, but often has a pseudocapsule in the soft tissues. On the bone, you're not quite sure. So where does it originate from? We did say it comes from the pterygopalatine fossa or the pterygomaxillary fissure, whatever you call it. And as radiology has become better and better, we now can say that it comes from the pterygoid canal or Vidian canal, whatever you call it, they are the same thing. And we know that what you see out here is a posterior view where you can see the pterygoid plates, and anterior to it, the pterygomaxillary fissure, and the tumor sort of juts out from the pterygomaxillary fissure into the infratemporal fossa, goes superiorly into the orbit. From the orbit, it can go posteriorly into the superior orbital fissure. And of course, it can go medially into the nasopharynx. And that's the typical location. So we know how it goes. We know that the blood supply is invariably the internal maxillary artery. And I'll tell you why. But as, again, radiologists become better, we also know that the Vidian artery is frequently. In fact, when we have started looking for it, we see it more and more. And now, because everybody is fairly well versed with endoscopic skull-based surgery and anterior skull-based surgery with endoscope, you know that the Vidian artery is an artery which takes origin from the second genu of the internal carotid artery and comes forward in the Vidian canal and into the pterygomaxillary fissure. And it is actually used as a landmark to find your way to the internal carotid artery. So this Vidian artery is generally seen in not every patient angiographically, but when you look at JNA or juvenile angiofibroma, this is almost always present, provided of course you do a good enough angiogram and look for it closely. Interestingly, both the internal maxillary artery and the Vidian artery are arteries of the first branchial arch, and I'll come down to that in a minute. Interestingly, again, the tumor is vascular, and the tumor is sort of going to all these places that we discussed, as you can see in the cartoon above, but it is attached really only to the pterygoid base. It is attached to the pterygoid base. This is a primary tumor. If you have a recurrent tumor, of course, it might have had adhesions. If you have packed the patient, it might have made adhesions because of the trauma. But a primary tumor is really attached only to the pterygoid base and a little bit to the lateral, to the medial wall of the medial pterygoid plate, the lateral wall of the nasopharynx. And this really marks the attachment of the tumor. The rest of the tumor is a polypoid tumor. It is intensely vascular, but it's really a polypoid prolapsing tumor, prolapsing elsewhere, which is why we have moved on to minimally invasive ways of doing this. And there are generally no other significant tumor attachments unless you're looking at a recurrent tumor. There are no other attachments. This is what the tumor is. So it's a peculiar tumor, and consistently it's this kind of tumor. So as I said, the Vidian artery is the artery of the first branchial arch. So this is the first branchial arch artery. And this is, as I said, a consistent approach. You would remember this diagram from your early days in your first year at medical school with the aortic arches, the dorsal aorta, the ventral aorta, and the arteries which connect the two. And as you may or may not remember, the third artery becomes the internal carotid. The ventral aorta becomes the external carotid, and the first and second communicating arteries degenerate away. But not quite. What actually happens is that the first artery on the external carotid side becomes the maxillary artery. And this bit where it was sort of connecting to the internal carotid artery, there's an anastomotic artery, is really what the Vidian artery is. You can see it on the other side. So the Vidian artery, which comes from the ICA, comes and connects to the maxillary artery, and there sort of joins the ventral aorta, which becomes the external carotid system. So this is the internal carotid system, this is the external carotid system. And the tumor is actually at the junction of these two, which is where the pterygomaxillary fissure is. So the internal maxillary artery is sort of culminating in the pterygomaxillary fissure, and the Vidian artery is also culminating in the pterygomaxillary fissure, and that really is where the tumor is coming through. So the current thought is that this is a tumor which somehow is related to the first branchial arch, and there is some histological and immunohistochemical suggestion towards this because they find this particular laminin alpha 2, which of course I don't know much about, but the literature tells me that this is something that is seen in arteries in the developmental phase, and so it sort of indicates that this is it. We on our part have tried to look at 5 fetuses wherein we sectioned them and sort of looked at as to whether we could find some tissue out there which may be hormonally hormonally active by looking at receptors on it by IHC. We couldn't quite find any such tissue, but you do find that even in the early fetus at 20 weeks, you will find a capillary plexus there. So there is normally a capillary plexus in the fetus at the pterygomaxillary fissure, and we have found some of this, and there's literature by Schick, who's also reported on this theory, though not quite on this histology. And this sort of suggests that we are looking at something from the first branchial arch. The other suggestion that we're looking at the first branchial arch is, of course, that with current level of radiology, you can see the Vidian canal, and when you see the Vidian canal, which you see here, the foramen rotundum you see here, the Vidian canal you see here, you see that it's eroded, and this is again a near consistent finding with this tumor. So what has happened is that we have moved on from calling it a tumor of the nasopharynx to calling it a tumor of the pterygomaxillary fissure to now calling it a tumor which is possibly a tumor of the first branchial arch or of the Vidian artery. So it seems that this is a hamartoma or a vascular malformation or maybe a benign tumor which is centered on the Vidian canal and the pterygoid base and the pterygopalatine fossa pterygomaxillary fissure. And what it is that sort of gets this capillary plexus into a hamartoma or a tumor is not quite clear. Maybe it's genetic because there is some association with familial adenomatous polyposis. So there is certainly some genes which predispose to this capillary network in the first branchial arch, capillary to capillary portal circulation picking up. And maybe it's an infection, and maybe it's just the hormonal surge of adolescence, and you're not quite sure what sets it up, but maybe we will. This is the most commonly used classification. I think most of you must be familiar with it, which is the modified Rutkowski staging classification. Many classifications have come and gone. We also had published one 30 years ago. Sad to say, it's not quite the most popular classification today. It's not relevant to current times because it was not quite based on CT scanning. It was just about the early CT scans that it was based on. But on current generation of CT scans, this is what we talk about. So stage 1 is when we talk about tumor to the nasopharynx and the posterior nose. And stage 2 is when we talk about extension to the pterygomaxillary fissure and the infraorbital and the infratemporal fossa and the orbit. And stage 3 is when we say that it gets to the base of skull or intracranial. But as we've just been discussing, there is no such thing as a stage 1 probably. I certainly don't see it in my book. There is no stage 1 because it is always involving the pterygomaxillary fissure. So it is always a little bit in the pterygomaxillary fissure. High resolution CTs tell you that, high resolution MRs tell you that. And occasionally you can have a Vidian canal which sort of erupts out into this lateral wall of the sphenoid rather than into the pterygomaxillary fissure, but that's most unusual. And really, we shouldn't be calling it a nasopharyngeal angiofibroma anyway, and we now, of course, call it a juvenile angiofibroma. So juvenile angiofibroma, originating in the pterygopalatine fossa, seems to be a first arch tumor. And now that we have sort of come so far, the observations that came in from the UK, really, from the Royal National Ear, Nose, Throat, seem to sort of gel and integrate with this thought, wherein the observation, of course, was that if you drilled at the pterygoid base, then it would reduce recurrence rates. And this again was based on radiology, which was well documented in the papers by Phelps and Howard and Dr. Cheeseman and Dr. Lund. So this is our contribution to the same thought, taking it forward. What was initially an hypothesis that this seems to be coming from the Vidian because we have seen it radiologically involving that area. Now we look at it in a prospective way, and I and my colleague got together for a year to look at 16 consecutive cases and we looked at how many of them had Vidian canal involvement, and radiologically we found 13 having Vidian canal involvement. All of these can show Vidian canal involvement. And then when we did the operation, we did two things. When we did the operation, we removed the tumor entirely as we thought, and once we thought that it was completely done, we went again and histologically sampled the mouth of the Vidian canal. And when we histologically sampled the mouth of the Vidian canal, we found residual tumor in 4 of those 16. After 2 fairly experienced surgeons had presumed that they had done a complete excision, and I think generally we do know what we're doing. Nevertheless, there was this histological residual microscopic tumor in the Vidian canal in 4. In one of these, it hadn't showed up on the radiology. So our final count went up to 14 out of 16 Vidian canal. So 13 out of 16 we had found on radiology. 1 more we picked up on histology. Don't quite know about the other 2. Maybe we missed them. Maybe we sort of plucked it out with the main tumor anyway, and there wasn't anything residual left behind. And then one of us drilled the Vidian canal and one of us didn't. So it's not quite randomized, but even if you look at recurrence rates, this small data suggests to you that drilling of the Vidian canal may make a difference to reducing recurrence rates. So this has already been said by Dr. Howard and Mr. Howard and Dr. Nikolai. And so this is where we are with regard to, I would say, basics or must know basics. And if we want to do questions now, we can do questions now and break, or we can move forward and do questions. So Shom, tell me, is it time for questions?
Prof, good afternoon. This is Mira.
Yep.
So far, there are no questions that have come up on the chat. So maybe if you want to carry on, we can take the questions cumulatively at the end.
Yep. So I'll go to part 2, and then if there are questions, we'll stop again.
Thank
I'll
you.
do to part 3. So this is the story so far. And what we'll try and do now is to see as to how we apply it to treatment. So there are hormonal receptors on tumor. We know this is a vascular tumor at the junction of the internal maxillary artery and the Vidian artery. We know that it is unencapsulated. We know that it sort of originates in the Vidian canal, pterygopalatine fossa area, and lobulated growth branching out from there. And we know that there are consistent tumor attachments at the base of the pterygoid base and the lateral nasopharyngeal wall. And we know that there is often invasion of the Vidian canal, almost always invasion of the Vidian canal. So going up from here, this is how we treat every patient, whatever be the stage of the patient, be it stage 2, be it stage 3, be it stage 3B. This is how we treat every patient. So we use the hormonal receptors on the tumor to shrink the tumor. It does work, and it does work safely. We embolize almost always. And then when it comes to surgery, we like to have good exposure, control the blood supply. We know that the blood supply is from the internal maxillary and the Vidian. And then we do a lateral to medial dissection. I'll expand on that, not quite. And then we go back to the Vidian canal to try and control for any microscopic disease which we might have missed. So from now on, you would see this scheme almost all through the presentation because this really is what we do. So let me take you through flutamide. The flutamide is an androgen receptor blocker. It's a little bit different from the old time way of blocking the hormones on the tumor, which relied on estrogen. And what estrogen probably did was to suppress the pituitary and so decrease the gonadotropins and thereby decrease the androgens. And maybe it made a difference. But of course, decreasing androgens had a fair amount of side effects. What flutamide does is that it sort of blocks the receptor site directly. So androgen levels don't actually go down, they actually go up. And they have increased levels of testosterone. And so side effect levels are much less. And before we started using it, we sort of checked up on the literature, and it's used in prostatic cancer, it's used in benign prostatic hypertrophy, and it's used in some situations which don't seem quite merit toxic treatments, such like acne. So of course there was literature out, and you would be very well aware of the literature. And there were two papers before we did this, one from Gates and one from Labra. So Gates from the US and Labra from Argentina, I think. And it wasn't quite clearly established. But we looked at a prospective trial again on a smallish group of fairly large tumors, because it wouldn't have been ethical to do it on smaller tumors. And we used 10 milligrams per kg per day for 6 weeks, pre-surgical, before we actually took the patient up for surgery, in an attempt to shrink tumor. And we did pre and post-op MRs. And yes, it was well tolerated. The literature tells you can have hepatic dysfunction. We do liver functions for every patient pre 3 weeks and 6 weeks, but we've never found a problem. But we did find over a 6 weeks course that there was transient breast tenderness now and then. If you give it long enough, you will get gynecomastia. And some of our patients have actually taken it longer than what we have prescribed. And I have seen gynecomastia, but I've never seen gynecomastia in 6 weeks. And we certainly did not see it in this study, wherein we were studying it. And we were particular about repeating the scan at 6 weeks and getting these patients for surgery. So at 6 weeks, it seems to be safe with regard to no long-term issues with regard to secondary sexual effect. In fact, we looked at it in great detail. If you read a paper, you'll get the full details. And this is what we found. So what you found is the difference in the pre-flutamide and post-flutamide tumor volumes as measured on the MR. And some patients actually got larger in those in those 6 weeks. And most others sort of showed some shrinkage, but not any dramatic. Some showed very dramatic shrinkage. So what you see out there in your maximum patient was 40% shrinkage of the tumor, which of course is dramatic for a 6 weeks treatment. These are some of our patients. Yeah.
Prof, just a quick question. One of the questions that they've asked is, what do you embolize with? And is it the IMAX that you're targeting on embolization?
So I'll come to embolization. So what do we embolize with? We embolize generally with gel foam because it's cheap and freely available. And you can use Onyx, but we don't really have too much of experience with that. So let me just rush through flutamide and get through to embolization. So all this I'm trying to say is that pre and post-op scans of the same patients who have had flutamized anti-androgen treatment, which are at the same level. You can see the fossa of Rosenmiller on both sides, exactly on the same side. You can see the torus there, and you can see that the tumor sort of shrunk up a bit by giving flutamide for 6 weeks. Another patient, again, it shrunk up a bit. You can see it was coming through the superior orbital fissure and onto the IC, and it shrunk away. And a couple of patients who had large tumors and causing visual field defects have improved. And I take you back to this waterfall plot, which sort of shows you how much regression we had. And what we found was that the blue are the patients who were less than 12 years of age and who had very low testosterone, and they didn't do so well. But patients who had reasonable amounts of testosterone did better. And that's looking at testosterone levels versus tumor regression. So you can actually tell which patients are going to regress or not by doing testosterone levels if you wish to. And just to say that we tend to use this regularly for every patient who's post-pubertal, more than 12 years of age, 13 years of age, because even a minor degree of shrinkage can be useful. It sort of better tumor, it better delineates the tumor when you do the operation because you can get around the tumor more easily. A plane is easier to find. And of course, if there is some compression of larger tumors on surrounding structures, then it helps. And sometimes you can sort of do less or do a less radical approach. So it makes your surgery. So now we come to embolization. And embolization, so pre-embolization, post-embolization, of course, you can see that it's a dramatic difference. We embolize almost always. We embolize only the internal maxillary artery. We do not embolize the median. It would be impossible to embolize to get a microcatheter that far up the ICA and then find the very small median artery would be an impossible task to do and dangerous. But the internal maxillary artery is very safe to embolize because, I mean, you can get your microcatheter in this artery and you can pass it on a fair distance. And you pass it on a fair distance and then you push the embolus, and of course that's so much easier. So you should do it as soon as close to the operation as possible, especially in our practice because we do not use a permanent embolization but something which is a temporary embolization, and I'll take you through that. So is it useful? There's a lot of literature to say it's useful. Is it essential? It helps, nice to do. But yeah, you can do without it. There are other ways of doing it. You could clamp the external carotid artery and then do the operation. You could find the internal maxillary artery and clip it before you touch the tumor, which is what we tend to do. But in our practice now, for the last 15 years, it is unusual to do it without embolization. At least in my practice, I can't say that for all my colleagues, but in my practice, I would often embolize some once in a while. If it's difficult to organize for some reason, we'll go ahead without it. Is it safe? There are two risks. One is that you can spill over the embolus into the intracranial circulation. And how does and the two is that maybe it increases residual disease. So this data also came from the Royal National Ear, Nose, Throat. This suggestion, and I'm not quite sure how, but the suggestion is that if you get an avascular tumor, and maybe you can leave some peripheral tumor which is sort of infiltrating the bone because it's not oozing or bleeding, and that's certainly possible. But I think all of us as surgeons will get better, and if you're aware of this issue, that it can increase residual disease because of that one hypothesis, you're on your guard. So nevertheless, something to be aware of. But the basic risk is that does it cause intracranial complications because it spills over into the intracranial circulation? This can occur either because the gel foam or the onyx goes through. When you inject the tumor directly or something, it can sort of go through and go on to the median and then on to the intracranial circulation, which can happen if you do an intratumoral direct injection. We don't do that very much. If you do an intratumoral direct injection, you need to be very gentle with it. You can't quite use force for that risk. We tend to do the intra-arterial. We are happy with it. When you do intra-arterial, the risk is that the microcatheter may actually jump back when you push the embolus, and it may then sort of come out and embolus some other instance. But that is not really a risk for the internal maxillary artery. I mean, that's something that you risk if you do a carotid body tumor embolization, but not for the JNA. In fact, for JNA in our radiology department, it is often the registrar or the fellow who's doing the embolizations because they find this a very safe place to work in. The internal maxillary artery being a terminal artery and being a very long artery, it's a safe place. So we tend to do intra-arterial with gel foam, a gelatin sponge. And of course, you can do it with many other things. You can do it with PVA and you can do it with onyx, but we tend to do this and it works well for us. Onyx is more permanent, PVA is more permanent. So if you were doing it 5 days before the surgery, then of course you would use one of these, which is unusual in our practice. We actually tend to do this either the day before surgery or often the morning of surgery. So we'll take them as the second case and we'll try and get our embolization done by 11 o'clock and get the patient straight to the theater. But it's how you can organize it. And of course, there are difficulties of scheduling. Then we come to the operation. In the operation, we believe in adequate exposure. So we believe in adequate exposure because you're looking at an en bloc resection. We don't like to do segmented resections. I know there's a lot of talk about segmented resections. especially when you do it endoscopically, that you remove it piece by piece. And I'm not saying that's not right to do, but maybe I'm just old-fashioned and prefer to do an en bloc resection. So wide access and exposure. And you want to do that because you want to do peritumoral dissection. You like to go around the tumor, revascularize it from the small capillary vessels that it would sort of take up along its pseudocapsule. It's primarily supplied by these by the two arteries we talked about, but nevertheless, you can revascularize, and we like to do an en bloc. So, as I said, many kinds of tumors. We actually get involved with some very fearsome tumors. But I think you just need to be focused here, which is I'm sure what you will be having in your practice. And I'll also generally keep focused to these ones. These are the usual operations we use, the nasal endoscopic and the midfacial degloving. Lateral rhinotomy is something we've moved away from over the years because you can do almost everything with midfacial degloving. But I tended to use it a little bit for a fair length of time when I was doing revisions because the patient already had a scar and sometimes we could improve that scar. And it's an easy, quick operation to do. But yeah, why do you want to give a scar if you can do without it? These operations, transpalatal, I have only done a couple in the last 20 odd years. One really to demonstrate my fellows and one other. Very occasional. There are special indications, but very unusual. And for intracranials, we generally tend to do one of these skull-base operations. So one is adequate exposure, two is control of the blood supply. So previously I used to loop it around with the negus and take a silver, and this is a maxillary artery which is sort of looping around. And nowadays, of course, you clip. So this is a patient who's having a maxillary swing operation, and you can see the incision of the maxillary swing, and you can see the tumor in the nose, and there you go, maxillary fissure, infratemporal fossa, and the vessel here is being clipped. So before the vessel enters the tumor, the internal maxillary artery, you clip it. That's why I said if you haven't embolized, you can still go ahead and do the operation because you'll always clip the vessel before you do the operation. And the third bit is what we call a centripetal dissection. As I said, the tumor is only attached to this one bit. So you need to basically get this pedunculated tumor mobilized so that this last attachment on the tumor and then this last attachment is lifted away with the periosteal elevator, and that really sorts the operation. And lastly, you go to the Vidian canal and you drill. And you drill a fair bit with lots of irrigation. And the reason for that, of course, as I said, was that we have found that there is residual tumor in the Vidian canal, even when you think there is none. So even in this patient, you don't quite see any tumor, but you like to drill about 5 millimeters of the anterior Vidian canal. And we hope that if there's something left behind the pterygoid base of the Vidian canal, you have cleaned it up. So the pterygoid base and the Vidian canal we drill. And that really is end of part 2. And I'm happy to sort of have a discussion now if you wish.
Right.
Otherwise,
now there are lots of questions, Prof. What is the role, if any, for digital subtraction angiography?
So digital subtraction angiography is something we don't do very much here. We do the CT. The point being that, of course, it's as good as an angiogram, almost as good as an angiogram. And there was a time when diagnosis was made by angiograms, and and a DSA would be a safer way of doing an angiogram. But if you really want to see the Vidian artery, it's difficult to see on a DSA. You could do a DSA, but I mean, just doing a DSA without embolization, probably not required, because I mean, it's such a consistent, you know what the blood supply is going to be. It's not like some other tumors, but you could do it. You could do it to see if there is contralateral supply. So while the internal maxillary artery is the main supply, you often get a blood supply from the ascending pharyngeal, from the facial, from the contralateral internal maxillary. So yeah, I mean, no harm certainly.
Okay, I'm sorry if you've already answered this question, but the next question is, do you routinely ligate the IMAX intraoperatively?
So there are sometimes difficulties. So let us say I do it 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10. The problem is that for very large tumors, it can actually be behind the tumor. So there can be difficulty in surgical access. So what you see out there, you see this this tumor. So the tumor is always in front of the vascular plexus. So if it's a very large tumor, then you probably have difficulty in going behind it. But yes, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, it is part of what we do and what we should do. As you know, there are going to be occasions when you can't quite implement all that you wish to implement, and it's an embolized tumor. So I may not do it right now. I may do a little bit of dissection. So as I said, number one is adequate exposure. Number two is vascular supply. Number three is lateral to medial dissection. So sometimes you might have to do a little bit of number three before you can get to number two. Just to get the vessel. But yes, I would. Every time I would.
The next question comes from Kieran, who says, thank you for a lovely presentation and sharing your experience, which is vast. He was wondering if you could indicate the nature of epistaxis, or what nature of epistaxis would indicate nasendoscopy in the juvenile age group, or as a general rule, unilateral epistaxis in this population, which of these should be scoped?
So yeah, I mean, certainly it's not the epistaxis of the Little's area or the Kaiser-Weiss plexus. So these patients, when they bleed, will bleed generally profusely. So if somebody has epistaxis without obstruction, then of course, the index of suspicion is not going to be that high. And if you see something in the Little's area, it's not that you need to put in an endoscope. But these are patients who would have profuse epistaxis. As I said, if this tumor is breached, it would bleed well because there's no blood supply on it. So the characteristic epistaxis is a profuse epistaxis, which may be anterior, which may be posterior, but generally anterior, which is nice because posterior epistaxis would be impossible to control in a small child. So generally anterior and generally profuse.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, yes.
The next question comes from Mr. Rajbala, who's one of our consultant rhinologists and skull base surgeons, and he's asking whether you use flutamide.
So we use flutamide very consistently for anyone who's over 12 years of age and demonstrates secondary sexual characteristics. I generally look at the armpit, and if I can see some hair in the armpit, I know flutamide is on. That is my test. You could, of course, do testosterone levels, and if they were high, then you would know that it would work. So in my situation, my waiting list is fairly long, and I find it a nice temporizing measure, and I use it for anyone who's post-pubertal. Yes, in fact, we recently had another publication which is getting quoted more than our first publication, wherein our neurosurgeons had a very challenging patient, used flutamide, and they shrunk so terribly that the patient developed a CSF leak. So yes, we do use flutamide for anyone who's post-pubertal. It's safe to use for a 6-week period. It's safe to use for a 6-week period. Even if it develops breast tenderness, it's transient. And you sometimes get a dramatic reduction in size, which is nice. It makes your surgery easier. So you want to use every trick in the book. And yes, I use. I don't use it for people less than 12 because they don't have the testosterone and there's nothing to block.
Thank you. So the next question is, let me see. Someone is saying they heard Dr. Janakaram from the Royal Pearl Hospital in India talk about JNA, and he mentioned that pre-op embolization made dissection of the tumor more difficult and potentially increased recurrence rates as well. So he just wanted to know your thoughts on that comment.
So both of these are there in the literature. Both these points are there in the literature. So Janki does it beautifully. He does a lovely operation. His experience, I mean, he doesn't have a personal experience in embolization, but the literature talks about both these things. As I said, I did say the issue about embolization. So the alternate is to clamp the external carotid. You should not ligate the external carotid because then if you have a recurrence, it will be based entirely on the video and it will be very difficult to handle. But if you clamp the external carotid, do the operation, and then unclamp it at the end, that's a reasonable way of doing it. So as I said, embolization is nice to do, but it's not essential. And there are other ways of doing it. This is what we tend to do. As I said, if once in a while we can't do it, we don't. We don't find inflammation too much of an issue, maybe because we do it very quickly or very soon before the operation. If you were doing it 5 days before the operation, certainly you would expect inflammation. So previously when we were doing it 2-3 days before, it would sometimes be painful. So, I mean, we use embolization for a lot of things. We use it for achromosis, we use it for some vascular tumors, and of course, once in a while it can be painful. So, it does cause inflammation. But if you are very quick between embolization to operation, that is less of a concern. But that's a good question.
The next question is, does embolization potentially make radiotherapy, if it's needed at a later date for recurrence, less effective because of relative hypoxia?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think hypoxia is a problem with this tumor. But maybe, yeah.
Another one of our consultants is asking, in general, Neil Bateman is asking, in general, he does an endoscopy for children where he cannot see an obvious vessel anteriorly in the nose, where
Yes.
there is bleeding which is persistent despite cautery, where I've seen a vessel, or where there is an additional history of nasal obstruction. So my threshold for doing it in outpatients has come down progressively over the years. Do you find the same thing?
True. True. Yeah. Of course. I mean, if you have an endoscope in your clinic, you would want to use it in anyone where you didn't quite know what was going on. So yes, threshold has come down, and if the child allows it, and they do, yes.
There's a few more questions. I think we'll only be able to take a few more because we'll have to move on to the next talk. But what do you embolize where there is a bilateral blood supply is the next question.
So it's the ipsilateral main internal maxillary artery. That's all you embolize.
And then the next one is, what powered instrument do you use for diathermy or hemostasis?
So we use coblation nowadays, which is nice.
So Mr. Colreevy over in Ireland, I think that answers your question about the coblator. And the next person is asking, any top tips on endoscopic resection of angiofibromas in your experience, mainly regarding expanding the access for a more lateral extent and access to the maxillary artery for ligation?
So I'll say 2-3 things. I have a very low threshold for a mid-facial degloving, and in my own practice, I tend to use that. If I'm not so sure, I can get around the tumor endoscopically. That is one, which is here anyway, and that was mid-facial degloving. When we do endoscopically, you can do a couple of things. Sorry. Yeah. So if the tumor which is very far anterior, then it's very difficult to work with the endoscope, because the endoscope basically works on doing a medial maxillectomy and then getting on and taking out the posterior wall of the maxilla and then finding the artery there. So if you can't quite get in on a tumor because it's very far anterior, then I tend to do what is the Denker's approach, which is a sublabial. And sublabial, and you sort of take out you do sublabial, you take out the lateral wall of the nose and enter the maxillary sinus, and then you can go directly to the maxillary sinus, because you have to first go lateral and find the vessel. And so you can do a Denker's, which is a sublabial approach to the nose and the, and it sort of makes your exposure so much wider. It's so much more convenient than working through a nostril. And again, there is no incision. And the third thing I'll sort of just demonstrate to you, which is something that a colleague in Bombay, Dr. Renuka Prabhu, was very keen on, which we call the push-pull technique, which is, so I mean, there are these many ways of going through. So this is not quite my video. This is one of my colleagues, but he's done. So this is Dr. Kapil Sikka and Hitesh, who are both colleagues of mine. And what you see out there is the maxillary sinus here and the tumor in the nose here. But this tumor is not coming too far anteriorly, so you can actually access the maxillary sinus. Go to the maxillary sinus, you sort of palpate the tumor, and you can actually see the vidion there touching getting onto the tumor. You can coagulate it there. You dissect around, and but this tumor is so big, you can't quite get to the maxillary artery from here. So I find difficulty. So it's not part of my way of doing things, but I'm not saying it's but this is a nice trick we used to do ages ago before we moved to endoscope, which is to make an incision in the sublabial area and put in your finger there and push the tumor. And of course, that is another trick if it's going far lateral. So we call this the push-pull technique. As I said, this was popularized by Dr. Bradu from Mumbai. And the push-pull technique is more push than pull, because you know that pulling can potentially disrupt your tumor, and if you disrupt your tumor, then you worry a little bit more about recurrence. So yeah, these are the tricks. 3 tricks. Do a Denkers. Don't get involved with tumors coming too far anterior. But if you do a Denkers and use the push-pull technique or convert to a mid-facial.
Thank you. I think for the purposes of time, we'll only be able to take one more question. And the question is, for the district general surgeon without access or experience with embolization, how would you recommend managing these patients presenting as an emergency with life-threatening epistaxis?
So when they come with epistaxis, you just pack. And that is generally quite effective in controlling the tumor. We have also found, but it's not published, that if you use flutamide, it can actually shrink the tumor and maybe stop the epistaxis. I don't know. One very difficult patient, I've also used thalidomide. It's an anti-VEGF, and but I don't know if it made a difference. But let us say 9 out of 10 times or 99 out of 100 times, it's just the pack and no more.
Thank you very much. I think we will draw a conclusion to the questions there for the moment. Thank you.
So I enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk and for your time. Thank you.